I believe we're going to have a really exciting discussion here for the next hour. We have a great panel with Anita Bales, who is the Director of DCAA, Tim Callahan, who is the Executive Director for Contracts for DCMA. Both individuals are senior executive service members. Monday morning I did a short introduction of Shay Assad. And I have been asked to make this short introduction shorter than Shay's short introduction. So I will do that. But I want to tell you a few things about Anita. Anita has one of the most interesting backgrounds of any person I've ever introduced. She has been the director of DCAA for about 3 years. Prior to moving in that position, she was the deputy director. I believe Pat Fitzpatrick is somewhere in the audience. Raise your hand, Pat. Okay, I don't see him. But Anita has been a part of the leadership team that took over DCAA at a point in time that the Congress was asking them to make major changes in the organization. She will share some of that. A unique thing about Anita that I had to get permission to share, one of Anita's first jobs was that she was assistant and supporting the state champion auctioneer in the state of Iowa. Okay, I think she may be the only person who have been in the auctioneering business and then went to DCAA. Tim Callahan is an Air Force officer. We have known each other forever. His career was in contracting. Then he went out to industry for approximately 11 years. He came back into the government, moving into his current position as the Executive Director of Contracts. There is no other organizations in the federal government who has more contact with industry than these two organizations. So without taking additional time, we'll let them speak. They will do 5 to 7 minutes comments up front, and then we will start questions and answers. So we ask all of you to start writing your questions early. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank Al Boynton for taking a second chance on me and inviting me again this year after last year at the very last minute. After 9 hours at Dulles Airport, the airline and I canceled out on him, so thank you for giving me another chance to come and talk. I'm going to do my best as the auditor here to not put up my defense shields, as I do know there's some triggering vectors that kind of head the auditor's way, and hearing some of those this morning in terms of barriers to entry, speed, why do we even need incurred cost audits, comments like that. I think all of those issues can be addressed where audit can be a part of the overall solution and not just a barrier to entry. So the 809 panel this morning, I'm glad I was here to hear that. I mean, they talked a lot about things that I think are very important and things that we can be involved in. They talked about goals and intent, and I think that is critically important. And part of that is, how do you balance competing goals? I mean, one of the things they talked about was also transparency. And I think audit is an integral part of transparency. But on the other hand, transparency might be a bit of a drag on the speed goal. So how do we balance those goals together? And I think as an audit organization, we need to be challenged to overcome those areas where we may not be supporting or really helping it reach that goal, but still be involved so we can do those goals that we are an integral part of. So the other thing I just kind of wanted to go into, because we always get this, is what are your big challenges? So I have to say two things: incurred costs and staffing. Those are, we got a lot of challenges, but I'll talk about those too. And incurred costs. So in case you haven't heard, we have a backlog in incurred cost. One of these days, I'm going to be able to come to these meetings and not say that. So incurred costs, we got to the place where we are because of an original staffing problem. Is our staffing, at one point DCAA had like a high of about 6,000 people. We went down to about 4,000 and maintained steady. At the same time, after 9/11, the amount of dollars going on contract just exploded. And we did not get our workload increased, and we did not get a staffing increase to do that. So incurred costs became our bill payer, because it was critically important that we got things out on contract in terms of, so we did a lot of focusing on forward pricing. So as you use one thing to do a bill payer, eventually that bill comes due, and our incurred cost bill came due, and we really started focusing on it in FY12 with how are we going to reduce this backlog. And I would say, it took us 10 years to really get to the backlog that we had when we started addressing it in FY12. And within 5 years, we have eliminated 75% of that backlog. So we are making progress. And we had like 4 things we were going to do to get rid of that backlog. One of it was a staffing increase, which we were successful, then we weren't successful, then we were. Our staffing has kind of been on a roller coaster. We start in 12, we get staffing, then we have 13, sequestration, then we get marks. So the roller coaster of staffing is one of the challenges. We were going to do dedicated teams to where people would not get pulled off of incurred cost audits to do something else. Low-risk memos, and multi-year auditing. All of that has helped us reduce our incurred cost backlog. We had, and I would say if we hadn't had those prior staffing challenges, we probably would be current today. We are now, our new goal after that was to be current at the end of 18, and I will say I think for the most part we are going to be there, but with this year's hiring freeze that we went through, that's had an impact. So I think some of our audits will roll over into 19 before we're current. And in current, that's, that may be a question that comes up, is what is current? We're looking at a 2-year cycle, but I can tell you current legislation doesn't have that in there. They're talking 1 year, and that just kind of moves me to the current legislation. Again, probably not surprising, we don't actually agree with everything that is in that proposed legislation as it relates to DCAA. The 2-year versus 1 year is one of the things that we're continuing to discuss. But I think as we look at that legislation, I kind of want to go back to what some of the members of the panel this morning said. And Elliot Branch mentioned that if the 809 panel came away with a really prescriptive set of rules versus an overall framework, you would think that's a failure. And they also talked about having flexibility. And I think as we look at the current legislation, the rigidity of what is in there is really causing us some concerns, and we think we need some additional flexibility than what they have in there. So we're continuing to meet with the staffers and members to have discussion on that legislation. So kind of want to end this part of my comments, because I really do want to get to your questions, and talk and really look at the theme that we see here of innovation, collaboration, and synergy, and talk about some of the initiatives that we are taking to do some innovation. The beginning of this fiscal year, we reorganized to where we are not just geographically organized, but we are also have a contractor focused, and we have created what we call corporate audit directors that include 7 of our largest, most widely dispersed across our organization contractors, so that we can take a look at how do we audit across the network, where before we might have a segment in this region, a segment in that region, and a segment over here, and they were auditing, and Now we're bringing it together as looking across the network, and we're finding several audit efficiencies that we can do and have those audits not only be faster and more efficient, but they're also more effective for us. The other thing that was talked about this morning was workforce, and we are working on a different way of training our workforce, especially our new hires. And as they come in, it used to be they'd go to their field office. Day one of our new hires is at our training institute, and we have now developed a training continuum that goes over their first year that is a blended mix of classroom training, practical examples out in the field, and then very structured expectations of what the on-the-job training is going to cover in between those classroom trainings, which really helps bring our folks up to speed more quickly, which I'm sure most of you out there would be grateful for, that as folks come in, they have a little bit more knowledge than what we may have had in the past. We're still, one of the things that we talk about as our auditors, and all of my auditors, to be in that job series, you have to have at least 24 hours of accounting. And quite frankly, anybody that has 24 hours of accounting probably has an accounting degree, because most people don't just go take accounting to have fun. So they have that accounting degree, but I will tell you, contract auditing is not taught in the accounting programs. So there's still going to be those things that we have to teach. The other thing that we're really doing, and this is going to kind of be my ask for you all too, we want to make a lot more use of data analytics than we have. And that allows us to take a look at things in the macro level, really look at where our risks are, and get focused from that macro level down to really doing the detailed auditing in the highest areas of risk. But this means we need access to data. So that's one of the things that I ask of you, is make sure that we can get access to that data. And part of that is building trust. And I kind of go in to move to collaboration on that, is how do we build that trust and work together to make sure that we can get through these things as fast as we can. And, one of the things that I heard from yesterday in terms of collaboration, I think we all need to talk to each other more than what we do. I understand that there were some questions during Shay's presentation about a company may get one answer from a field office here and then get a different answer from a different field office. Now, I can tell you we're doing all our best to make sure that doesn't happen. But there is judgment in auditing. But what I would ask of you is, please, if you have those issues, don't sit and stew about them. Make sure you elevate those issues. Talk to not just the auditor, the supervisor, the manager. Go through that. And, really, if it gets down where it can't be resolved, it's anita.bales@dca.mil. Let me know. We will get those. It's so much easier to resolve the issues as we go through instead of waiting till 2 or 3 years down the road. I had one, it was like, and this was from a government person that said, well, they've been doing this in 13 sequestration, and I heard about us. I said, that's been 3 years that person's been stewing. We need to get over that and move on and get better. So that's what I ask, is make sure we talk to each other. That's how we're going to get through things, and we really need to improve that collaboration. And just internally, and I'm sure Tim will go into it too, that with the PCOs and DCMA specifically, we've got a lot of initiatives going on, and how do we get involved earlier in the process to make sure that we understand roles, responsibility, who's going to do what, and really make those expectations, and also working through some incurred cost issues. So then let me go to synergy. And I think, this one I want to say, all of us here, we have the same goal. We want to make sure that we get our warfighters the things they need to make us safe. And we all just have a different role in that ultimate goal. And sometimes those roles are going to cause friction, and that's okay. I mean, that's where we come at it from different perspectives. But that's, again, where we talk through those issues that cause that friction. And we will then make sure that we all can reach that ultimate goal, which I think that's what's so important in what we do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Tim, before you start.
Sure.
I want a foot stop on a takeaway. If you have an issue with DCAA, what should you do? Elevate. Does everybody have in their notes? Anita.Bales at DCAA.com.
Did
everybody write that down?
I won't have the answer, but I'll get the person that does.
But you move it up the chain. So you shouldn't have issues that you're stewing about for 2 or 3 years that you haven't elevated. For the young man who wanted to know something that he could take back to his company, please take Anita.Bales at DCAA.com.
I'm going to have to work those spam filters now.
Tim.
Over to me. Okay, if you got any issues with DCMA, it's Anita.Bales.
See, I told you we work together well.
One of the things I often say when talking to a group of contractors is one of the things you need to know if you don't is who is your ACO? The time to find out who your ACO is now when you've got the contract and when there's not a burning platform. Building those relationships and those communication links are very, very important. So again, establishing that relationship and that communication link is critical. And if you don't get satisfaction, then you can go through the elevation process. I'm proud to be here today representing DCMA and throw out a few fun facts that you might be interested in. We have oversight responsibility for 19,000 contractors and about 345,000 active contracts that represent about $227 billion in unliquidated obligations. We also have oversight of about $162 billion in government property that's in the possession of contractors. We manage and monitor about $31 billion worth of contract financing payments in any given day. That's progress payments or performance-based payments. And one thing that became abundantly clear about a year ago is we authorize to the tune of about $455 million a day in contractor payments. So if there's a disruption in our service, and if we were to lose our IT capability because of an intrusion, we're going to affect the defense industrial base. We're going to affect cash flow for a lot of contractors. So really kind of a huge, really important mission that we have. We have about 12,000 people in the agency, and that's down from 1990 when all of the contract admin activities among the services were consolidated. Back then, there were about 25,000 people among the services and DLA that were doing contract admin. That number went down to between 8,000 and 9,000 in about 2008. Wow. Since then, we have rebuilt, and we're up right around 12,000 employees now. About 1,000 of those employees spend their day worrying about cost and pricing issues. About half of them are in our cost and pricing centers. The other half are out within the CMOs, within our integrated cost analysis teams, and the individual CMOs. So a lot of people doing a lot of work and a lot of folks dedicated to cost and pricing. Many of you probably know that we just got a new director of the agency, Vice Admiral David Lewis. He came to Fort Lee, where our headquarters is in Virginia, from San Diego, where he was the commander of SPA War for the Navy. So he comes to us as a program manager, as a PEO, as an individual who has a bachelor's and a master's degree in computer science. That is a huge sea change for the agency, which has historically been led by career professional contracting personnel. You can look at Darrell Scott, who was here earlier today, Charlie Williams, recently retired Director Lieutenant General Wendy Masiello. All of them had career contracting experience. So we have got a new leader with a new perspective. And I will tell you, his commander's intent to the agency was boiled down to three things. He says, we deliver the product for the warfighter. And he says, he acknowledges it's industry's responsibility to design, develop, and produce those products. But we, DCMA, are the individuals in the factory, on the factory floor, overseeing the production and delivery of those products. He says we need to be effective, efficient, and affordable in what we do. If we can't do our job better than anybody else, we won't be in business long. That workload will go back to the services. Lastly, he said his commander's intent was to work smarter, not harder. And that really resonates, particularly if you listen to the 809 panel and talked about the need for agility and the need for speed. We're in a rapidly changing world, and if we don't adapt with our insight and oversight as an agency, we're going to die on the vine. So those are things that that he communicated to the workforce as he was taking command. He also communicated directly to me that one of the high priority targets on his scope is contract closeout. That's interesting because when you heard Ms. Bales talk about incurred cost audits, that's been kind of one of the holdups in being able to work off the backlog of overage contracts that are physically complete. We've been waiting for DCAA audit. Well, DCAA has moved the pile, if you will. I say they threw the dead cat over the fence. It's now with DCMA. We have a backlog of contracts in MOCAS that are overage for closeout to the tune of about 69,000. Of those, better than 43,000 are within DCMA's control. By that I mean they're not pending litigation or investigation. We're not waiting for audit product. We have what we need to be able to go forward, settle rates, negotiate rates, and close the contract. So this is a material weakness for the agency. It's something we report to OSD on, and we have been working a plan to reduce that backlog. And for the first time this past year, we've actually seen this thing crest at just over 70,000, and we're on the downhill side now. We put a corrective action plan in place and are working it really hard. But I can tell you, what interests my director fascinates me, and contract closeout interests Admiral Lewis. So more to come on that. I'd like to talk briefly about a couple other things that we've been working on that may spur some questions. Commercial item determination and pricing. That's obviously been a big issue with Congress over the last few years. In fact, if you go back to 2013, they mandated DOD establish a capability to facilitate the determination and pricing of commercial items. DOD gave that mission to DCMA. So we have established commercial item group with 6 centers of excellence around the country that are there to support the procuring contracting officers, who are the ones that have the authority to make the determination as to whether an item is commercial or not. We make recommendations to them, and I can certainly give you some statistics of how we're progressing and what we've done to really step up to that challenge. But that is clearly something we're working very hard and have our eyeball on. Last thing I'd mention briefly, it comes up in a number of meetings with industry. It has to do with contractor business systems. And when I came back to the government in March of 2011, there was a big push to establish contractor business system accountability. There was new clause, there were rules that apply to that. There's new authorities that were given to the government, leverage that we had to disapprove business systems and withhold contractor financing payments until those deficiencies, significant deficiencies, are corrected. So we have been working that very hard. There was a lot of people at the time that were very concerned that DCMA, which approves or disapproves the system with input on 3 of the systems from DCAA, were going to run amok, that we were going to use this new authority willy-nilly. We were going to go around and just disapprove business systems just because we could. Well, I'm here to tell you we didn't do that. We put a lot of checks and balances in the process to standardize what we were doing to drive consistency. And we have right now about 8,500 contractor business segments in our contract business analysis repository, a database, CBAR, that we track. Those are cage codes where there is a business system status attached to that cage code. With that over 8,500 of those cage codes in the system, we only have 80 cage codes today that have a disapproved business system associated with it. About half of those are disapproved accounting systems. About 16 of the 80 are estimating systems, and 15 are purchasing systems that are disapproved. The other systems, earned value, material management, and accounting and property, have not risen to that level. So we've made a lot of progress there. Industry has really stepped up and has really done what needs to be done to have approved business systems. But I will tell you, we are currently withholding just under $300 million in contract financing payments against disapproved business systems. And the largest withholds are against the estimating systems. And that's something that should concern all of us in this room when you talk about contract cost and pricing. If we don't have a good estimating system with industry and we're not getting good results out, then we're negotiating at a disadvantage. And the contractors are also dealing with a system that's not providing them with information they can rely upon as they're building their proposals and their estimates. So it's a big deal. I will tell you this, and then I'll turn it back to Frank. One of the things we've done when we're looking at business systems is, we also look to see whether there are any particular trends or areas where either we're being overly aggressive or where perhaps there's a problem with the criteria of the system and we're seeing the repetitive problems. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing those kind of trends out there. We do see there's some problems with inadequate policies or where the policy might be adequate for the system, but the contractor's personnel at a particular business segment may not be implementing their policy effectively. But I'd like to tell you, if you fix these 2 or 3 things, we're going to be good to go. We really isn't that. You got to pay attention across the board. So with that, I'll turn it back to Frank.
All right. Well, Tim, let's start there. You're talking about business system rules and the time. I think they have been in place a little over 5 years now. What have you learned from the reviews that have been completed, and what would be something that you would share with the audience in terms of how do we make this work better?
Fair enough. Fair question. Again, early days, I would say we probably could have flagged a certain area or two where everybody was stubbing their toe, but that really isn't the case. So I would just encourage you to make sure that you are reading the individual business system clause, reading the criteria that's in there and understanding that criteria, reaching out to your ACO for if you got questions. One of the areas that we evaluate is contractor purchasing systems. And I will tell you, on our website, we host our CPSR guidebook. This is what our analysts use when they go out to conduct the review. And if you go through that, you'll see what we're looking at. You'll understand where we're focusing and where you need to put your attention. But overall, I think we have worked very hard, again, within the system to make sure that before we would ever disapprove a business system, that we've done our rigor, that we understand what the deficiency is, whether it's significant, what the impact is, and then we go through a review process that brings it all the way up to our headquarters, where we'll convene a panel and even invite DCAA, if it's one of the systems they're prime on, to make sure that we understand what the issue is and that it really does rise to the level of significance that it is a material defect in the system. So again, communication, collaboration is really what I would counsel.
Okay. Anita, I'm going to give you 2 questions. We'll start off the first one, and then I'll give you the second one. You talked about the training program that you're doing for the new auditors that are coming in. there are lots of complaints about all of the young auditors in DCAA and challenges industry is incurring because of their lack of experience. What are your thoughts about this, and how do you believe your training initiatives are helping to accelerate their time to full competency?
So, one, I think it is obviously, like this year alone, I'm going to have to hire a minimum of 600 auditors. So we do have a lot of people coming in. I think it's a problem that's not just isolated to DCA. I think across the acquisition community writ large, both the government and private, we got a lot of new folks. So probably it's not only training my folks, it's also making sure that the contracting officers and the contractors understand, and we do a good job of explaining to them what they may not have had experience with as well. Mm-hmm. So with our new hire training continuum, one of the things that I think that is really going to be beneficial is, and this is also just not just training, but more of a philosophy that we're trying to implement now, is that we don't just have an auditor come in. We send them to 2 weeks of training. They go back to their office and say, congratulations, here's your audit, go have a good time. What we want to make sure that we're doing is that we're pairing those up with more experienced people in a team, and they go out and do that. So they'll go to those first 2 weeks of training, which, part of that is, hey, you got to fill out all your personnel forms too, But then we get into the basics of the acquisition cycle, what kind of audits we do, what you're going to be working on. And then we have specifically set out a list of, before you come back again in 8 weeks for your second in-class training, here's what we expect you to do while you're in the field. Mm-hmm. So you can now apply what you just learned. Because part of it, we had been training some things, and maybe that first week of that 2 weeks, maybe it was an incurred cost audit that we walked them through to know how to do, and they go back to their field office and they're working on a forward pricing. So what we want to make sure is that they actually get the opportunity to apply the training very quickly after we've given it to it, so it helps it sink in. And it's also not just the expectations that we're putting on the new hires that go through the training, but it's also the expectations that we're putting on the supervisors. One, you can't expect these folks to come out of 2 weeks of training and know how to do an audit. You do have to help them. You have to provide that OJT, and so we're really putting a lot more rigor into our OJT program.
Right. Tim, would you like to address that same question from the perspective of DCMA and what you're doing to fully develop your workforce?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. We have, within DCMA, and I talked about the 12,000 people, 3,000 of those are in the 1102 career field. And that's really the 1102 and then the 1103, which is government property, are really responsibilities that I have as the functional lead for that area. And so we are very concerned about the skill set of our workforce. We have worked, and in fact, it started under Mr. Williams, who worked with DAU to establish the College of Contract Management, where they will specifically develop and present courses that are relevant to the contract management, the work that DCMA does on a daily basis. If you looked at DAU and their course curriculum previously, there was, Frank, you might know that, the former president of DAU, it was really weighted towards the pre-award, if you will, and not so much the post-award. So this really was an attempt to tailor courses that our ACOs, our contract administrators, our property administrators really are targeted toward their needs. And it wasn't just theory. We're developing courses that are reduction to practice, where they actually teach the how-to and the hands-on what's necessary. So that's something.
Applied learning.
Say again?
Applied learning.
Very good. Applied learning. That's important. What's also worth noting is within the 1102 career field within the agency, we're experiencing about a 10% attrition per year. So we've got a pretty significant turnover that if we don't have the training in place, we're really going to be behind the power curve. So that's really important. I'll give you another statistic that's might be interesting, a fun fact. DCMA's 1102 workforce, I think it's 55% of that 1102 workforce has 10 years or less experience with the agency. So we have a fairly young workforce that are still learning the ropes, and what we don't have as much of are the more seasoned in the trenches professionals to provide the kind of OJT that really helps bring these folks along. So it is a challenge. We are working that very hard, but in partnership with DAU, we're making good strides.
Right. Anita, here's a good question that I think you will find interesting. What are the challenges you see if private accounting firms perform contract audit?
So that is part of the legislation that we're not in total agreement with. I think one of the things that we look at is, first, the incurred cost audit, and this could go back to one of those questions this morning of why even do incurred cost audits. As we do our entire portfolio of different audit services, from forward pricing to incurred costs to post-award, looking at vouchers, provisional billing rates, every one of those audit efforts informs the other. Mm-hmm. So as we're looking at incurred costs, we're learning things that help us do forward pricing. If you pull incurred cost out of the mix, then we're going to build in inefficiency to our other audits. At the same time, if the IPAs pick up that incurred cost audit, work that we do in terms of vouchers, which is more inherently governmental, that they won't be able to do, that we use to inform the risk to say, can we put those audits into our low-risk pool and go into sampling them? I don't know how the IPAs will be able to assess that risk and be able to potentially put those into a low-risk pool and sample. So I was up in April and was testifying in front of one of the subcommittees on the HASC, and we talked about our low-risk pool. And over the last 3 to 4 years, there's basically been 14,000 audits that we didn't do because we considered those low risk and then put them into the sampling, and only a small percentage of those get done. So if we can't determine the low risk on that, does that mean that that's going to be that many more audits that come back into the system? And then the second part of it that I have a concern with is the actual knowledge and skill sets. Because one of the things is we talk about what we do with contract audit and that it's not taught in the schools. There is not really a high supply of this knowledge and skill sets that comes into auditing, not just GAAP, but the cost accounting standards and the FAR. There's not a high supply of that in the private sector because there is not a demand for it. We do not do this when private sector contracts with private sector. So my concern is, how are they going to get that skill set? I mean, some of them said, one of the members of one of the industry groups told me, oh no, there's groups out there that have that skill set. They have a lot of ex-DCAA auditors. That's part of my concern, and that would tie right back into potentially my staffing and my training problems, is that if there suddenly becomes a demand for that in the private sector, I think one of the great sources of it is going to be DCAA.
Mm-hmm. Now, y'all need to know that this is the heaviest input of questions that we had today, so I know we're not going to get through them all. So one of the things that I'm going to do is to try to pick the hardest questions. Okay.
And those are going to Tim, right?
So I'm going to do the next one with the two of you. There's a great emphasis today to expand commercial item buys. How is this increased emphasis being implemented in both DCAA and DCMA?
Tim, I think you should start because it really begins with you.
Really, it is an area that we're putting a lot of attention on. Again, if you go back to the NDAA for 2013, that's when DOD really recognized the need, and at the behest of Congress to embrace commercial items. And really the whole push is to attract non-traditional DoD contractors to our marketplace and be able to take advantage of the innovative thought and new technologies that are growing out in the commercial world but are not being offered to DoD because of some of our arcane processes, if you will. So we did establish a commercial item group, as I mentioned earlier, with 6 centers of excellence. They're at Boston, Philadelphia. St. Petersburg, Florida is really where kind of the hub or the lead for it. Indianapolis, Denver, and Phoenix. And so we've got these organizations stood up. We piloted it, and we actually achieved full operational capability in 2016. So we do have folks that are out there. We have a mix of both business and technical personnel within these centers of excellence, not just contracting personnel, but also engineers. It really helps with the market research that they do. Just to give you an idea of where we are, first of all, we don't get the black or white commercial, non-commercial items to look at. We're not looking at a pencil to determine whether or not it's commercial, and we're not looking at a JDAM, a bomb to decide, a mother of all bombs, if you will, to decide whether it's commercial or military. We're operating in the gray area, but our charter is to use as broad a definition as is reasonable to arrive at that commerciality determination, because it relieves industry of having to provide certified cost and pricing data, but it also allows us to use other means and techniques to price those items. So it's really a pretty strong initiative. Just little statistics for FY17. So far, we've received 409 cases and about 2,214 items to review. 249 of the 400 cases have been closed, and of the items we reviewed, which is like 1,667, 1,566 we have recommended to the PCO that these are commercial items. That's a 94% commercial recommendation that we're making. And I will tell you, the bar is really high for a PCO to go against our recommendation. So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny and a lot of review of that. So that's something that we're doing. We're able to provide that recommendation within about 10 days of receiving the request if it's for a commerciality recommendation. If they're asking for assistance with pricing to go along with that, then the turn time goes up to about 44 days. But we do have people that understand the technology involved, the material involved, the processes involved, that can really help understand what goes into it, and they can also understand the market and what's out there that might be comparable that we can use to benchmark for pricing. And I'll give you one last thing, and then I'll get off the stage on this particular item. One of the things we've done is established memorandums of agreement relative to commercial item determination and pricing with 3 defense contractors. We're close to getting memorandums of agreement with 3 other defense contractors. And what these do is they're agreements with the corporation as to what data they will provide to help us reach that commerciality decision or recommendation. And then the other part of that agreement is they'll also identify to us what sales information or other type information they might have that they will provide to us to help us determine what is a fair and reasonable price for that item. So we're very actively engaged in that. We're making progress. And if you just read the NDAA for 2016 and 2017, Congress's interest in commercial items has not waned one bit. We're getting a lot of help.
Okay.
So where we really come in is helping out in terms of that after it's been determined whether it's a commercial item or not, is what information do we have that can help with that fair and reasonable price. and having access to the books and records we have and the history we have from some of our other audits, we can provide additional information. So if we get a price, well, was that a price for when someone came in and bought one and we're going to buy 1,000? So, and things like that. So that's the kind of information that we're working with DCMA to really help define what our role is going to be in that. But really, it's being able to provide that additional data as we come to that price.
Okay. Now, this is my favorite question. And
it doesn't talk about Daryl's socks, does it?
No,
Okay.
no. What can we in industry do to receive better love from DCAA and DCMA?
Well, I don't know. Do you want to start, Tim, or do you want to? I think
What
better
can
love,
better love. I would think, first of all, you got to shoot straight with us.
Yeah.
You got to provide the data you have. That you're required to provide. It needs to be current and accurate, complete. Like say, establish that rapport up front before there's a burning platform, so we have a communication and a rapport established that facilitates exchange of information and understanding as to where we're coming from. I really think communication is key, and that's the bottom line. If I spent, I'm going to correct Frank a little bit. I spent 9 years in the private sector, not 11, but that's close. And I spent 2.5 with a large company and 6.5 with a small tribally owned company. And I got to tell you, I was never asked or put in a position to compromise my integrity. The companies and part of the companies I worked with were straight up, and they were trying to do their dead level best to perform to the contract and deliver a quality product on time at a fair and reasonable price. I honestly believe that the vast majority of the men and women in the defense industrial base are hardworking, patriotic Americans, and sometimes we let a few bad apples cast a aspersion over the whole group. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. Sure, that's what we've got to do. That's our job. We're looking out for doing our stewardship for the taxpayer. But come to work every day, give it your best, be open and honest with us, and I think that's how we build that relationship and build that trust.
Tim, because of your significant contributions while in industry, you got credit for 2 extra years. Anita?
So I would agree, with a lot of what Tim said, really the communication. I think one of the things that we need, like when we come in and we ask for a walkthrough of the proposal, make sure the right folks are there. And we want to because that will set the tone of the audit to go from the beginning. And that's the time where we can talk about, this is the kind of data we're going to need. This is, and how long is it going to take you to do that? I was telling a group last night, and hopefully we're moving out of this as we catch up. I was actually on vacation in Quebec City, and I saw Iron Mountain. I hope I never have to really hear so many more stories about Iron Mountain. But one of the things is we understand that sometimes it takes time to get data. But let's have those discussions up front about what is reasonable. And then very similar to what some of my PCOs told me is, I may not mind a 90-day audit, but I don't want to hear it's a 30-day audit 3 times. So that's very similar to when we say you're going to have data in 2 weeks, and then it's another 2 weeks. And then, that's where I'm telling my folks that we need to elevate on our side as well. As I told you all, when you have a problem, make sure you elevate it. I'm telling my auditors that that's what we need to do to make sure we get these done. And, we don't want to be out there dropping, access to records letters and things like that, because those are the types of things that create angst, where if we can just really get that worked out up front. So I would propose having a lot of meetings and discussion. And it doesn't mean we want to have a meeting just to have a meeting, but definitely as we begin an audit, we need to talk about how to proceed through it. And then when we bring back results, let's have those discussions again on what they mean. And when we do an incurred cost audit, you get more detailed results than you will on a proposal audit. And that's just the fact of going into forward negotiation versus the incurred costs. So part of it is also, I'm telling my folks, it's okay to talk to the contractors. Because, we got burnt pretty hard at one point that we were too involved. And we were probably, actually preparing some of the incurred cost submissions. So from our perspective, too, we need to make sure that we are communicating. But I can't agree with Tim more that so much of what comes to issues in audits, in just about every aspect of life, comes down to we're not communicating well.
Quality and timely proposals would be a good start also.
True. And we do have, it was interesting as I was going through the hearing, one of the things that came out in some of the industry concerns was that, oh my gosh, we have mandated in FAR what it requires to be adequate. But quite frankly, it's going to be one of those things of be careful what you ask for, because that's what industry had asked us. We had an adequacy checklist, and they wanted to know what it took to have an adequate proposal. So basically the same thing that we always had just got codified in FAR, and then it came out is that we were creating additional requirements. But that's one of those things. It's just, we gave you what you wanted. And we think it's a good thing because it does bring things up front, but it's not additional, and we don't think it's an added burden.
Okay. There appears to be inconsistency within DCAA on what certified cost of pricing data is required to be included in certifiable cost volumes, specifically materials and subcontracts. What is the agency doing to ensure consistency during the pre-award audit phase of a contract?
So let me take subcontracts right now. And we know that subcontract management is a much larger issue. That's what he's going to do with the questions he doesn't want to answer. That across the board, because subcontracts have become such a much larger part of the defense industry now. And one of the things right now, we are training all our first-line supervisors, and we're doing it over a span. We got 4 separate weeks going on, and it's in Oklahoma City. I came from there. And one of the sessions we have is talking about what do we need in the CPSRs for subcontracts. And so we're having some discussions on that. Part of it, a lot of our, before we issue the policy out of our policy group, we want to have what are the issues that are coming up from our auditors, and we're probably also going to have discussions with DCMA and industry groups about how do we get over this. So we're in the process of really taking a hard look at subcontracts right now. And we expect policy to be coming out on that, but we want to make sure that we vet it well before we establish that policy. And then we also we have this training. Now, I've got right now about 4,600 people. We train every one of them. I'm not going to say that every one of them hears the training the same way. Just like when you all leave here, what I've said is probably going to be taken 5, 10 different ways, at least. So part of it is when we do see that inconsistency, that goes back to you telling us and making sure that we're aware of what inconsistencies are out there so we can make sure that we are training against those.
Okay. Tim, a question for you. If the commercial pricing center deems something as a commercial item, how can they enforce a claim of commerciality to all DCMA, DCAA, and buying commands?
So if I heard that correctly, if DCMA recommends that an item is commercial, how is that then communicated and enforced?
Standardization across the board.
Sure. One of the things that we have done is establish a database that's accessible throughout the acquisition community within DoD of the items that we have commerciality determinations that have been made. We have our recommendation, and then we have the ultimate decision by the PCO. So we capture that information. It's in there by part number, by noun, stock number. So it's searchable database internal to the government. There was in fact, in legislation about a year ago, there was a requirement for it to be a public-facing database. Industry pushed back on that and got changed legislation to say no, it should only be government only. So we do have that database where we capture our recommendations. It's there for PCOs to see. The contractors themselves will know what we recommended and what the PCO had decided. And then if another buying activity comes to them to buy the same item, they can inform that buying activity that a commerciality determination has already been made. And if you're going to override a determination of commerciality that a PCO has made, it's got to go to that organization's head of the contracting activity, the HCA. So it's a fairly high bar to overcome a determination. So if you're buying a particular piece of avionics for the Army, is buying it for maybe one of their helicopters, and it's been determined commercial, the Navy comes in, wants to buy a same or similar item, and it's already been determined to be commercial, they're going to have to go to their HCA if they want to determine it to be something else in order to get the certified cost and pricing data. So we do have that as a mechanism that's there.
Okay.
If I may, just one other quick data point. General Masiello, this past year before she retired, signed out a letter to the individual services saying, when you make your determination, you need to provide it back to DCMA so we can capture that in that database.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. If the government's acquisition community is seeking to reduce process, innovate solutions, streamline overall operations, how is DCAA and DCMA adjusting their behavior to complement those goals while still protecting taxpayer interests?
So I think, some of the things that I talked about earlier, it is we are trying to use more automated techniques, such as data analytics. One of the things that we're working on right now is a coordinated audit effort on some of our business systems. We started this with one contractor on their MMAS system. Rather than DCA coming in and doing the audit alone, we are actually working with their internal auditor, where we have a mixed team, where their internal auditors are on our team, and we are sharing data back and forth. And I think that, it goes to the innovation and also the huge aspect of collaboration, where when the rule first came out several years ago, where we were talking about getting access to internal audit reports, many companies did not even want to give us a list of what the titles of the audit reports were. So the fact that we are now being able to work with this company and have daily access with their internal auditor and working together, where we share our results, everything we do on that audit, we're sharing with their internal auditor, and everything they're doing, they're sharing with us. It's absolutely reducing time for both of us in doing that audit. And it also addresses some of the differences between what the business system requirements are for the government and the cost accounting standards versus what the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements are. Because that's another thing that we hear frequently is, well, it's already been audited SOX, why does this not work? And that's very financial statement related, and especially when you're looking at an MMAS, there's not going to be a lot coming out of SOX that would cover that. So those are the types of things we're looking. We are challenging ourselves to say, we know, just like Tim said, that the Admiral said, that if we don't continue to evolve and work with the new challenges that are coming up, we're not going to be able to be viable. So we need to make sure that we are providing timely, relevant services to our customers to make sure that we are protecting the taxpayer. And that is an important aspect. And I think as we talk about those competing goals that I mentioned and that came out of the 809 panel this morning, speed is an absolute necessity, and we understand that. But there's also times where that speed and that expedience is so necessary that you may need to be able to give up some controls and oversight because the cost of the controls and oversight aren't worth the benefit of the speed and expediency. But at some point, then it starts to, and I kind of relate that from the time I was in the Army, and we would look at certain controls, and you go into theater day one, there may be some things that you're not really too worried about if the auditor's going to know that we checked off on how many bullets we spent that first day. But as time goes on and you get into a more battle rhythm, then controls can come back in, and they do provide protection not just of internal processes, but protection of the taxpayer. And as we talk about speed and saving also taxpayer dollars, because one of the things is we talk about being able to buy what we need to buy, and we have to do it fast. We also need to have the money to buy what we need. And, we've helped the last 3 years, several years. We've saved made recommendations that were allowed us to save anywhere between $3 and $4 billion a year. And that's $3 and $4 billion a year that can go back into buying other stuff. Some of that money goes back to the Treasury, but others go into buying other things. And I use this example of one of the first, when I first came to DCAA, we were looking at one of the contracts. And it was an IED defeat equipment. And we went in and we were doing a forward pricing. And I don't know, it was like $30 or $40 million we had come in with in terms of recommendations for that negotiation, that we were able to reduce the cost $30 to $40 million. That money didn't go back to the taxpayer or to buy, but it went to buy additional IED defeat equipment. So you have to think of how many more of our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen that were in theater that were being protected by that IED additional IED we were being allowed to buy. So I think that's that balance of competing goals.
Okay.
Can I make real quick, protecting the taxpayer? I don't know whether I didn't hear him yesterday, but if he talked about commercial item determination of pricing, one of the things he probably would have said was, he doesn't care whether it's determined to be commercial or not. I think he does, but what he's really concerned about is the price that the government is paying fair and reasonable.
Right.
So whether it's commercial or not, that's interesting, and it has, there's some details that go along with it. But the real bottom line is, are we getting a fair and reasonable price?
Yeah.
So that
he did talk about the reasonableness test. At the end of the day, is this a reasonable price?
Absolutely. And two things that we're doing, we engage over the last several years in conducting overhead should cost reviews. We do that at the behest of the service acquisition executives. Each year we ask them, what are the major buys they've got coming, which contractors are they going to drive the most dollars to, that we need to understand their overheads. And we did 7 overhead should cost reviews in FY16, and of that we recommended over $900 million in recommended cost reductions or adjustments based on those reviews. The other thing we do to help look out for the taxpayer, as well as streamline the process, is forward pricing rate recommendations and better forward pricing rate agreements that our DCMA negotiates with the contractors. That it absolutely streamlines the process for the buying activities, and we've worked very hard to put those in place with the major defense contractors, and based on what we've got in place in terms of FPRAs, we project about a $3 billion savings over about a 4 to 5 year period based on those rates that we were able to agree to.
Tim, Anita, I know we're getting to the end of our panel. For the rest of the question, these are going to be quick-fire questions.
Okay.
No long answers, short, quick answers. And I'm going to try to give you short, quick questions. Anita, is it acceptable to have a third party determine if a subcontractor's accounting system is adequate for a cost-type contract? Or is it only DCAA that can do that?
Maybe.
Okay, that's a good answer.
You wanted a short one. I'm going back to what they said this morning.
A
Yes,
little longer than maybe.
I think, again, it depends on how much interaction we have and what the expectation is, what the materiality of that system is, and how much is it going to interact with all of the other systems that we're looking at.
Okay. Why is it taking so long to get FPRAs?
Obviously, we provide information to DCMA to do that, and part of that has been a staffing issue for us. And we've really, again, focused a lot on incurred costs, but in the last probably year and a half, we've really brought back in our focus on FPRAs as well. So we've been able to do a lot of those, and part of this is working with DCMA now where even before we get proposals, we're starting to do work, and we're doing work throughout the year that will help us move those out faster.
Okay. What are two recommendations?
By the way, I need FPRAs in place. It's part of my performance plan.
All right,
and I'm here to help Tim do that.
But I will tell you, the direction to me was we need forward pricing rate agreements, but we don't need a bad forward pricing rate agreement. It's got to be reasonable, and if we can't reach agreement, we'll go with the forward pricing rate recommendation, and we'll go from there. But we're not going to put a bad agreement in place.
And I will say I have one ask on that, because part of it is we go through these and then there's an update to the submission that may be, very quickly afterwards, helping cross-reference and kind of track through what the changes are so we don't have to start all over again, and being able to just really address those changes would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, now Al Borkin is standing over on the side with the hook.
Okay.
Now I want both of you to ignore him for a minute.
Okay.
Okay, don't see him.
Okay.
What are two recommendations, quick fire answers, that both of you would make to the Section 809 panel for their consideration? Two things from both of you, and we'll do a wrap.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we're both trying to think and do this fast, so we're pointing to each other. I think one of it is, again, make sure that you bring the audit community in to talk about what are those competing goals, and make sure we understand the intent of what you're trying to accomplish. Because I will say that, like with the current legislation out where we're talking about going to the IPAs, what is the intent of doing that? If it's to get the incurred cost backlog down, is that the right way to do it, or is another way? If it's to lower the barriers of entry, it doesn't matter who does the work. It's what regulations are you auditing to. So that would be two of my recommendations.
All right, Tim.
Raise thresholds where it makes sense to raise thresholds. Let's get out of the weeds and let's do those things that are really material. Secondly, we got some legislative relief on contract closeout, which is for contracts awarded prior to 2000, that allows us to offset cleanse within a particular contract or even among contracts if they're physically complete, there's no outstanding issue, what have you. But we can't reconcile. We're allowed to do that. So I would say look about bringing that to maybe 2005, 2006 contracts awarded prior to that.
Would everybody please join me in giving a big thank you to Tim and Anita.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.